Firstly, I feel sick just thinking about this. If you search for the castle on the internet, these days you can get a neat little return with some easy walking routes and a link to the National Trust. In the early 2000s, there were a few paranormal links where people had suggested local groups in Dorset visit the site, but nothing was conclusive. I want to tell you about a collection of times I visited the location between 1982 and the millennium. I say that I visited the place. It was more like a forced activity to help me try and lose some weight and join in with traditional family excursions. They like to ramble. It would be fair to say that over the course of our family holidays to that area of Dorset, I must have been to Coney's Castle about 30 times, and each time there was the same atmosphere, for different reasons. Let me describe the area for you. It's stunning. Day or night, that area of West Dorset is beautiful and well worth a visit. Looking down from the ridge, a carpet of woodland and green fields stretches away from you. You have a large Iron Age hill fort at one end called Lambert's Castle. At the other end, the smaller remains belong to Coney's. At the time of writing, the National Trust have up on their website a perfect quote to sum them up. The hill forts of Lambert's Castle and Coney's Castle are less than a mile apart, so you can easily explore them both in a day. Each one has a different character, but both have a rich past. We had been going to the same little cottage in a nearby village since I could remember. It was cheap, quaint, and the perfect place for me and my sister to explore without getting under our parents' feet. The castles were so close that every couple of days we would walk to Lambert's and have a picnic on one of the sweltering slopes. Then, if there was time, we would walk along the ridge to Coney's. In case you're not aware, the hill fort castles aren't buildings made of stone or brick. They're the remains of ancient strongholds on top of a prominent place. The main defence for our ancestors back then were big ditches and furrows encircling the whole encampment, sometimes with wooden spikes at the bottom. In the 1980s and up until the present day, these ditches are full of brambles and small trees, just as painful. We found great fun in running around the raised areas between the ditches to see how long it would take to meet the other person coming back the other way. It was essentially a ring around the entire area, and there was no possibility of getting lost. You just had to watch out for tree roots and patches of stinging nettles. The views over the rest of Dorset are breathtaking, especially on a sunny day. You can sometimes even see the coast. We loved these family walks so much that we started going to the castles after our evening meal. It was easy to see the walking trails by moonlight, and after a blisteringly hot day, the ground would still be giving off heat even though the sky was black and studded with stars. Everything started to change when I got lost at Coney's Castle. On one of these nighttime adventures, it was usual that each of us walked separately along with one of our parents, up the lane from the cottage to the top of the ridge road. We'd choose to go either left or right. Left was Lambert's and right was Coney's Castle. For some reason this time, it was my sister and I that were walking together and the adults were behind us. We knew the road to Coney's Castle so well that we decided to run ahead to the small gravel car park which was a lay-by and wait for our parents there. Now, bear in mind that this is a straight section of open road on the top of the ridge with the dark woods of a castle ahead of us. There was no way you could get lost, even if you've never been there before. You just go straight until you hit a gravelled area at the start of the woods. So, we ran forward, and me being older, I sped up, making good headway. I was laughing and expecting my sister to be grumpy when she turned up last. I didn't look behind me. All I remember is suddenly feeling extreme fear, and although I was running, the world around me kind of slowed down and I became unsure of my footing. If you've ever been exhausted or drunk, It was that feeling of moving through viscous air. Every time my feet hit the tarmac of the road, I was unsure if I was going to fall over. Naturally, I slowed down. I was breathing hard and I thought I might have overexerted myself because I was pretty heavy for a kid. But that didn't help. I looked around in the moonlight and I wasn't at the part of the castle with the little gravel car park. I was in a bit just over to the left where the small ditches started. For me to get there, I would have had to run through the gravel car park and through the first set of trees, an extra couple of 100 metres. I panicked at that point and ran backwards towards the road where I met my sister and my parents, who were also wondering where I was. I was so shaken that I couldn't describe what had happened. All I knew was that I didn't want to go back over there. We decided to continue down the road a bit more and then head right over a stile into an open field area so we could look out over the lights of the villages down towards the sea. This was still part of the castle grounds. My sister was bored and kept whining, so my parents asked me to stay back on the road with her while they went down to take some photos using a tripod. When it was just me and her on the road, my blood ran cold again. I kept telling myself I was scared from before, but then she held my hand. She hardly ever did that. She kept saying to me someone was watching us. I tried to make a joke and tell her it was a fox or a badger, but she was getting really anxious. We called to our parents and eventually they came back. We both ran as fast as we could out onto the open road on the ridge and away from Coney's castle. After that night, whenever we had the opportunity to go on an evening walk, we always opted to go to Lambert's castle or down to a stream at the bottom of the village. My parents didn't feel the same as us. During the day, they made us walk back to Coney's castle, thinking that it would rekindle our confidence. It did the complete opposite. When you're a kid, especially if you're a kid from a large city, you don't always know what the countryside should sound like. In a town or a city, you have the constant hum of cars, buses, trains, building work, human life. So when you come to the countryside and it's quiet, you kind of expect it. A few years after the strange nighttime incident, we were being forced again to go and take photographs at the castles. We had analogue cameras, it was the early 90s after all, and my parents said that they wanted to include our pictures in a holiday diary. We spent a couple of hours at Lambert's castle. It was really peaceful and we saw rabbits running around. There were some cows in a field on one side of the road and no people at all on the rest of the hill. After a picnic, we all walked towards Coney's castle. It was just after lunch and the day was really balmy. Considering that Coney means rabbits, we didn't actually see any rabbits there at all, not even on the flat grassy expanses. The small wooded areas were really chilly. My parents got annoyed as I constantly asked for my jumper. My sister was waiting around by the gravel car park, and my parents had gone back to the field to look down over the villages and farms, hoping to get a shot of the coast in the distance. I decided to go and look at the middle of the hill fort, which is a kind of flat area of long grass on the left side of the main road. I waded out into the massive green stalks that were waist high, hoping to get a really good photo of the meadow. But when I went to take the picture, my camera jammed. It was a wind-on type of camera, so there was a big button to take the photo, but it just wouldn't press down. I thought at first that I'd forgotten to wind on the film after my last photo, but the winding mechanism itself was also stuck. Everything was completely jammed. I cut my losses and trudged back, the long grass making my legs itch. I reached one of the embankments at the side which was covered with the remains of a season's bluebells, so I tried again to take a photo of them, but still, everything was jammed. I sat down on a dirt path and looked up at the trees. It took a while to register what was different. I slowly realised that there were no birds, not even birdsong in the distance. I was a keen bird watcher, and in the holiday cottage garden, as well as on Lambert's castle, There were always hundreds of small birds, great tits, greenfinches, hedge sparrows, blackbirds. Yet here, all I could hear was the breeze rustling and the leaves and grass moving. I stood up and walked back to a gravel car park area where my sister was still stomping around. Apparently, her camera wasn't working either, and it was only on photo 15 out of a roll of 24. My counter was on 11, plenty of photos left. After a few minutes, my parents came back to meet us, and they also sounded irritated. Their cameras weren't working. My dad had a high-quality SLR with a telephoto lens set, and as soon as they walked to the edge of the field to look down over the valley, everything had ceased to work. It was at this point that we realised something odd was happening. When I mentioned the lack of birdsong, or any other animals at all for that matter, my dad became really uncomfortable, and we walked briskly away back down to our cottage in the village. Strangely enough, our cameras all started working once we were back on the High Ridge Road. Anyway, my parents still believed that it was a good place to go for a short walk, and so we traipsed our way back to Coney's Castle multiple times over the next decade. As my sister and I got older, we were able to decline going along with them, but at night it was the worst. Yet, somehow, we always ended up there as a family at least once every trip. I can tell you now, when I have visited there, even since, there have been little or no birds, and certainly no bigger wildlife like rabbits or foxes, despite it being the absolute perfect habitat. When I was about 19, I went on one of my last family holidays to Dorset. I was older and going to university. I loved the area, but I also wanted to save up my own money and start to travel abroad. Being older, my sister and I made a pact that we would go to Coney's Castle alone at night on the last evening of the holiday, a kind of dare, like a sibling rivalry challenge. We kept psyching each other out on the build-up to the walk. Mum and Dad said they would come with us but wait by the field gate next to the Ridge Road, leaving us to run into the woodland area all on our own. I was scared. I didn't want to let my sister see or I'd never live it down. She'd be telling all my friends what an idiot I was, scared of a few dark trees. We left the cottage together. After Mum and Dad waited by the gate, I expected her to run on ahead. Instead, she walked at a steady pace, and I matched her steps. She was silent, and I could see her jaw was tense when I looked at her. I really didn't want to do this, and so we agreed that, instead of going into the wooded area on the left of the road, we would go to the open field on the right where my parents' cameras had jammed. We would walk all the way to the far edge of the field and then back on our own while the other person waited on the road next to the stile. Then we'd both walk back to where our parents were waiting. No running was allowed. If you didn't touch the fence at the far edge of the field, you failed the challenge. As always, up on the ridge, the moonlight was more than adequate to see the road and the worn trail through the grass of the field. We walked down the road until we got to the old wooden stile. My sister wanted to be the first to walk the gauntlet, so I begrudgingly agreed to stand in the shadowy road under the edge of the trees, waiting for my turn. As I watched the bright white of my sister's t-shirt get smaller and smaller, I tried to squint my eyes back along the road and make out my parents' forms against the night sky, but they were too far away. Again, there were no noises. I found myself straining to see or hear anything. All of a sudden, I jumped in fear. I am not ashamed to say I nearly crapped myself. I heard an extremely loud scream. It was blood-curdling. At first, I thought it could have been my sister if she'd fallen over the edge of the ridge in the dark. I soon realised it hadn't come from that direction. It had come from the opposite part of the castle that we weren't in, behind me in the woodland. I tried to calm down. My heart was beating in my ears and my lower back was drenched in sweat. I didn't hear the noise again. I tried to remember what it had sounded like. I reasoned with myself that it was just a fox barking. This was the middle of rural Dorset after all. My sister seemed to take forever to come back to me. I was all too happy to leave her standing on the road while I took my turn and half walked, half jogged across the open field away from that woodland. I touched a slumping barbed wire fence at the far end of the field, and I looked across at the pinpricks of house lights dotted across the valley. It was so peaceful. I imagined it blanketed in snow as part of some stock footage for a traditional carol concert on TV. Now I had calmed myself down, reasoning that the cry must have definitely come from a fox. I started to walk back casually towards the stile. Wanting to freak my sister out as much as possible, I walked slower than her, pretending I was a zombie. I could see her white t-shirt as a block of colour on the road by the stile. Then, my blood ran cold. Behind her, something else was moving. It was a bit taller than her and appeared to be like a pale brown shape. It sounds stupid now, but try to imagine a skinny grizzly bear. Because it was dark, I had no idea what it was. I started running towards her and she began taunting me, saying how I'd failed the challenge. I just shouted at her to get back to Mum and Dad. I felt awful, and as I got closer to the stile, I saw the brown figure run off into the woodland through the gravel car park. I didn't have a clue what was going on. I hadn't seen the person's face. I mean, it could have been a local person up the castle that startled the fox that screamed. I mean, to be fair, it could have been anything. My sister was already running past the car park back onto the road, and I was just on her heels asking breathlessly, "Did you see it? Did you see it? It was right there." She was half crying and half swearing at me, telling me I was an idiot for trying to frighten her. We reached the dark silhouettes of our parents, and I was immediately scolded for terrorising my sister. She turned around and pushed me really hard and told me that if I ever did that again, she'd kill me. Years later, when I asked her what had scared her, was it me or something else? She refused to answer. She just said, "You know what it was. I don't want to talk about it." Anyway, that night, after our argument, we went to sleep, and I must have had some kind of adrenaline crash because I passed out straight away. Either that or I was just tired from exerting myself. I still wasn't the fittest person, and I hardly ever ran anywhere. I can tell you now that I had the single most terrifying dream that I have ever had. I was so struck with fear that I wet the bed. I'm not kidding. I was trapped in the dream, and I didn't know that it wasn't real at the time. I believed it was happening to me, and when I explain it to you, you'll think it's even stranger. In this dream, it was a dark, cloudy night. It was cold. I was running along the ridge road towards Coney's castle. When I mean running, I mean pounding the ground. The road was more cracked than I remember it, paler, concrete coloured, and my footsteps sounded really strange. When I looked down, I was wearing red paint and stiletto shoes, and I was a woman. I had slender legs, and I could see that I was wearing a brown tweed skirt. In the dream, I knew I was a woman. I didn't feel at all like a man, not at all like myself. I knew that I was female, and Jim, didn't exist. The only thought in my head was pure fear, and I had to get away from something. I was running quite well in the hills, and I had a long stride. I couldn't see the fields on either side of the road. They were just a blur as I was moving so fast. I didn't look back. As I pumped my arms to run faster, I realised that I was wearing a long fur coat. It was light brown and looked really expensive. I ran faster and I felt my breath catch in my lungs so hard that I thought I was going to vomit. I got to the place on the road where the stile and the open field were to my right, and the gravel car park lay by, and woodland was behind me to the left. But there wasn't any neat gravel laid down. It was just a muddy patch of compacted dirt. I stood for a few moments, contemplating the field to the right. It was open and steep. Then I changed my mind, and God knows why, I decided to run into the centre of Coney's Castle with its rows of ditches and embankments. Immediately, I realised this was a bad decision, but I knew I couldn't turn back. I had to get distance between me and my pursuer. I was confused. The usual paths and trails, they weren't there. There was no signage from the National Trust, and everything was very overgrown. My long, heavy fur jacket kept catching on the brambles and twigs, and I fought my way through, but it was so cold out there. I needed it on or I'd freeze in my light blouse. I was getting tired, and I found it harder to go on. With every step, my stiletto heels were digging into damp mud, and my heart was pounding through my chest. And that's when I heard it. More crashing through the undergrowth, behind me, and someone else's breathing heavily. A man. I could hear him swearing under his breath, and I knew he was following my obvious trail through the foliage. I screamed so loud that my throat felt like it ripped. It wasn't even a word or a sentence, just a scream. And then he was on me, beating my head with his fists until I became unconscious. And that's when I woke up screaming in real life in my bed. My sister was in the twin bed next to me, and she was looking at me as if I was crazy. My whole body was drenched in sweat, and the mattress was soaked from where I had peed myself. All I could see in my mind was the brown figure behind my sister earlier in the evening, and then I felt the dreadful, real horror of being beaten to death. It didn't even factor into my brain that I was a woman in the dream until I processed it later on. I honestly couldn't wait for it to be morning and for us to leave that cottage. If you gave me a map now, I could draw you exactly where I'm sure this woman died up there. I even checked all missing people's records from around the 1960s, as that was the era that was implanted in my head in the dream. But there was nothing that even matched up closely to it. No description or photograph that fits the woman that I was in that dream. Now, you've probably listened to all of that with a pinch of salt. It could just be the hormonal dreams of a young man, a person who's already been scared of a weird place and has an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what that place felt like. It still feels like it now. I also know that I have never experienced that feeling in the dream again, even when I've been messing around in graveyards at night, even when my friends forced me to do a Ouija board and a séance when I was at university. Nothing compares to Coney's Castle.